For 5 days, the only world Violet Vance knew was the suffocating darkness of a chicken coop. The stench of feathers and droppings clung to her like a shroud, a bitter perfume replacing the gardenias of her wedding bouquet. Her pristine, ivory silk gown, meant for a cathedral aisle, was now shredded and stained, a testament to her desperate flight. Each sunrise brought the renewed terror of discovery, every rustle of the prairie grass, the sound of approaching doom. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of a life she'd refused, starving and broken. Then, on the dawn of the 6th day, a long shadow fell across the coop's slat-board door. A low, gravelly voice, weathered as old leather, cut through the silence. "I know you're in there. Come on out." The name Thorn was a brand seared into the hide of Redemption County. It meant Powerland, and a brand of justice that flowed from the barrel of a rifle before it ever saw a courtroom. Silas Thorn owned the Rocking Tea Ranch, a sprawling empire that drank up the rivers and starved out smaller homesteads. His son Jonah was his heir, a man who wore his father's reputation like a tailored coat, handsome in a cruel, predatory way, with eyes that assessed everything for its value. Violet Vance was to be his most prized acquisition. Her father, Jonathan Vance, was a merchant from back east, a man with fine sensibilities and failing finances. He'd come west chasing a dream and found only dust and debt. The deal he struck with Silas Thorn was simple: his daughter's hand in marriage for the complete erasure of his debts and a lucrative partnership. To him it was a masterstroke of business. To Violet it was a death sentence. She had met Jonah Thorn on 3 carefully chaperoned occasions. He never spoke to her, only at her outlining the duties she would perform as his wife, the heirs she would provide, the way she would adorn his new, ostentatious ranch house. He looked at her not with affection, but with the smug satisfaction of a man who had just purchased a fine, thoroughbred mare. The night he'd cornered her in the hallway of the town's only hotel, his whiskey-sour breath hot on her face as he gripped her arm, was the moment the vague dread coalescing in her heart sharpened into pure, cold terror. "You'll learn to be obedient, little bird." He'd hissed his thumb, digging into her flesh. The Thorns always get what they want. The wedding day dawned unnaturally bright, the sky a vast, indifferent blue. Violet stood before the mirror in her room, the ivory gown a beautiful lie. It was imported from France, a confection of lace and silk that felt more like a burial shroud. Outside, the sounds of celebration were already beginning, but inside, a silent scream was building in her chest. Her father knocked, his voice strained with forced cheerfulness. "It's time, my dear. Your future is waiting." That was the moment she broke. Her future wasn't waiting. It was a trap. While her father went to fetch the carriage, Violet moved with a speed born of panic. She ripped a small travel satchel from her wardrobe, stuffing into it a loaf of bread, a canteen of water, and a small leather-bound book of poetry, the only thing that felt truly hers. She tore the cumbersome veil from her head. Then, without a second thought, she climbed out the window, dropping the 10 feet to the soft soil of her mother's neglected rose garden. She didn't run toward the town. She ran away from it into the vast, open rangeland, her white dress a beacon against the ochre dust. She ran until her lungs burned and the fine leather shoes were scuffed and broken. She ran until the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and purple. For 2 days, she stumbled through the wilderness, following a dry creek bed, the bread and water dwindling. The sounds of the wild so romantic in her books were terrifying in reality. The howl of a distant coyote, the rattle of a snake she thankfully never saw. On the 3rd day, she saw the riders. A posse of rocking tea-men, their silhouettes stark against the skyline, sweeping the plains. Jonah was hunting her. Panic lent her a final burst of strength. She scrambled into a thicket of mesquite and scrub oak, praying they wouldn't see the flash of her white dress. They passed by, their voices carrying on the wind, coarse and cruel. She knew then she couldn't stay in the open. That's when she found it. A small, dilapidated homestead, seemingly abandoned. The cabin was boarded up the well dry, but behind it stood a low, rickety structure, a chicken coop. It was filthy forgotten, but it was cover. With the last of her energy, she pried open the flimsy door, slipped inside, and collapsed into the dusty straw, the frantic clucking of a few remaining half-wild hens. Her only welcome. For the next 5 days, that fetid, claustrophobic space was her sanctuary and her prison. She rationed the last crumbs of bread, licked dew from the boards in the morning, and listened. She listened to the sounds of the chickens, the wind, and twice more, the terrifyingly close sound of hoofbeats and men's voices calling her name. She became less of a person and more of a terrified animal hiding in its burrow, praying the predators would pass. On the morning of the 6th day, the hunger was a physical pain, a hollow ache that gnawed at her insides. Despair was setting in. Perhaps it was better to be found. Perhaps anything was better than this slow starvation in the dark. Then came the new sound. Not a posse, but a single horse, its gait slow and steady. Footsteps heavy but not hurried, approached the coop. She held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. The world went silent, save for the thumping in her own ears. A long shadow blocked the slivers of light coming through the slats. A voice, deeper and calmer than any she had heard in weeks, spoke into the quiet. "I know you're in there. Been seeing tracks for 2 days. Figured a coyote was after my hens, but these ain't coyote tracks." A pause filled with an unnerving patience. "Come on out." It wasn't a command filled with malice like Jonah's would have been. It was a simple statement of fact, tired and certain. Violet squeezed her eyes shut. Her desperate flight was over, caught like a fox in a trap. With trembling hands, she pushed against the flimsy door and stumbled out into the blinding morning sun. The man standing before her was carved from the very land he stood on. He was tall and broad-shouldered, but with a lean hardness that spoke of work, not wealth. His face was weathered, browned by the sun, and etched with fine lines around his eyes. A thick, untamed mustache covered his upper lip, and his hair was the color of dark earth. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a startlingly clear shade of grey, like a winter sky, and they held no judgment, only a deep, profound weariness. He looked at her, at the ruined dress, the matted hair, the dirt smudged on her cheek, and his expression didn't change. He was holding a rifle, but it was held loosely in the crook of his arm, not aimed. "Name's Calvin Stone," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Folks call me Cal. This is my place." Violet could only stare, blinking in the harsh light. Words failed her. She tried to speak, but only a dry croak emerged. She swayed on her feet, the world tilting precariously. Before she could fall, he moved. He set the rifle against the coop, and in 2 long strides, he was there, a strong hand gripping her arm to steady her. His touch was firm, impersonal, but it anchored her to the spinning earth. "Easy now," he murmured. "When's the last time you had water?" She shook her head, unable to remember. He led her not to the boarded-up cabin she'd first seen, but to a smaller, sturdier one, set behind a cluster of cottonwood trees, almost hidden from view. It was a simple one-room dwelling, but it was clean. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a simple cot was pushed against another, and a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs sat in the center. It was the home of a man who owned little, and needed less. He sat her down in a chair that felt impossibly solid beneath her, and handed her a tin dipper of water from a bucket by the door. It was the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. She drank it too fast, choking, and he took it from her gently. Slow. You'll make yourself sick. While she sipped more carefully, he moved about the small cabin with an economy of motion. He stirred the embers in the hearth, added a few pieces of wood, and put a pot of coffee on to boil. He cut a thick slice of bread from a loaf on the counter and put a piece of dried venison beside it. He placed it on the table in front of her without a word. Violet stared at the food, then up at him. Why, she whispered, her voice raw. Cal Stone leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked out at the vast expanse of his land, his gaze distant. My ma used to say there's two things a man can't abide on his own land: a predator killin' his stock, and a soul in need. He could have helped. He finally looked back at her. You ain't a predator, so that just leaves the other one. She ate slowly, deliberately, each bite an agonizing pleasure. The silence in the cabin was thick, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the whistle of the wind outside. Cal didn't press her for answers. He let her be granting her a space of quiet dignity she hadn't felt since she'd climbed out that window. When she finished, she felt a sliver of her strength return. My name is Violet Vance. He gave a slow nod. Pleased to meet you, Miss Vance, though I reckon you're a long way from wherever you started. You don't know who I am, she asked, a sliver of hope in her voice. Should I? There aren't posters, men looking for me. He considered this for a moment. I go into Redemption for supplies once a month. Ain't due for another week. Out here, news travels as slow as a lame horse. He gestured to the world outside his door. This is my news. Relief washed over her so potent it almost made her weep. For a few more days at least, she was just a woman who had gotten lost, not a runaway bride with a vengeful groom on her trail. You can have the cot, he said, interrupting her thoughts. I'll take the floor by the fire. You're safe here. That night, for the first time in a week, Violet slept in a bed. It was a simple straw tick mattress, but it felt like a feather bed from the finest hotel. She was still wearing the ruined dress, but Cal had given her a heavy wool blanket that smelled of wood smoke and clean air. She watched him as he checked the locks on the door and window, his movements deliberate and sure. He banked the fire, then rolled himself in a bedroll on the floor, his back to her. He was asleep in minutes. Violet lay awake a little longer, listening to the man's steady breathing and the lonely cry of the wind. She thought of the cold, dismissive eyes of Jonah Thorne, and then of the quiet, weary compassion in Calvin Stone's. She had run from a palace and found a strange, unexpected sanctuary in a hermit's cabin under the protection of a man who asked for nothing in return. As sleep finally claimed her, she wondered which of the two places was the real cage. 40 miles away in the town of Redemption, the name Violet Vance was not being whispered with concern. It was being spat with accusation. Silas Thorne, a man whose face seemed permanently set in a mask of grim authority, had orchestrated a masterful campaign of deceit. He and Jonah had ridden into town the day after the wedding was meant to take place, not as a jilted, embarrassed family, but as victims of a terrible crime. Sheriff Brody, a man whose spine was made of jelly and whose mortgage was paid by Thorne's generosity, listened with a furrowed brow as Silas spun his tale in the center of the saloon. She was a sweet thing, Sheriff Silas boomed his voice, carrying to every corner of the smoky room. Delicate. From the east. My boy Jonah was taken with her innocence. He placed a heavy hand on his son's shoulder. but it was a trick, a long con played by her and her conniving father. Jonah, playing his part, looked devastated, staring into a glass of whiskey. The night before the wedding, Silas continued his voice, dropping to a conspiratorial growl. After we had settled her father's accounts, in good faith, she cleaned out the hotel safe. Took with her the Thorne family heirlooms, a diamond necklace and a set of emerald earrings meant for my own mother. Been in our family for 3 generations. She's not a runaway bride, men. She's a thief. A common, calculating thief. The story was perfect in its vicious simplicity. It preyed on the locals' inherent suspicion of Easterners and their soft hands. It replaced the embarrassing narrative of a bride fleeing a thorn with the much more palatable one of a powerful family being wronged by a cunning outsider. It turned Violet from a victim into a villain. "I'm posting a reward," Silas declared, slapping a piece of paper onto the saloon wall. $500 for the capture and return of the thief Violet Vance and the Thorne jewelry she stole. The amount was staggering. It was more money than most men in that room would see in 2 years. Suddenly, every ranch hand, every prospector, every drifter passing through Redemption had a vested interest in finding the girl in the white dress. The hunt was no longer just about Jonah's wounded pride. It was about cold, hard cash. Back at Cal's homestead, blissful ignorance reigned. The days settled into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Violet's strength slowly returned. The shame of her ruined dress was acute, and she couldn't bear to be idle. She insisted on helping. Cal, after a brief, gruff refusal, relented. He didn't own another dress, but he gave her a pair of his old work trousers and a linen shirt, which she had to roll up at the sleeves and belt with a piece of rope. The clothes were ridiculously large, but wearing them felt like shedding a skin. She was no longer Violet Vance, the bartered bride. She was just a person trying to earn her keep. She learned to mend the tears in his clothes with clumsy, uneven stitches. She learned to knead bread, her soft hands, protesting at first, then growing stronger. She learned to feed the chickens, the very ones who had unknowingly sheltered her, and collect their eggs. Cal was a patient, if silent teacher. He would demonstrate a task once with his sure, capable hands, and then leave her to it. He rarely spoke of himself. His past was a locked room. But Violet saw the clues. She saw the way his eyes would sometimes drift to a small fenced-off patch of ground near the cottonwood trees, where a single weathered wooden marker stood bearing no name. She saw the carefully folded child's blanket at the bottom of his storage trunk when she was looking for spare cloth, and she noticed that he never ever spoke the name of a woman. The loneliness in his cabin wasn't just a lack of people. It was a palpable presence, a ghost that sat at the table with them during their quiet meals. One afternoon, while she was scrubbing a pot by the water basin, he returned from checking his fences, his face grimmer than usual. He tossed a fresh rabbit on the counter for their dinner and began to unbuckle his gun belt. "You're getting good with that needle," he said, nodding toward a patch she'd sewn on his shirt. It was the closest he'd ever come to a compliment. A small smile touched her lips. "My mother tried to teach me embroidery once. I fear this is a poor substitute." "It's more useful," he stated simply. He paused his back to her. "Found tracks on the North Ridge, shod horses, at least 3 riders. They weren't just passing through, they were searching." Violet's blood ran cold. The fragile peace of the past week shattered. Thorne's men. Likely he grunted. He turned to face her, his grey eyes serious. "My being out of touch with town ain't gonna last forever. Sooner or later, I'll have to ride in for salt and flour. Sooner or later, someone's gonna come knocking. You need to tell me what I'm dealing with, Miss Vance. The whole story." The time for secrets was over. Taking a deep breath, she told him everything. She told him about her father's debt, about the forced engagement, about Jonah's cruel touch and possessive words. She spoke of her fear, her desperation, and the suffocating feeling of the gilded cage that had been built around her. She left nothing out. When she finished, the silence in the cabin was heavy. She watched his face, terrified he would see her as a foolish girl who had brought a world of trouble to his doorstep. She expected him to tell her to leave, to take her chances in the wild rather than risk the wrath of the thorns. Calvin Stone slowly ran a hand over his jaw, the rasp of his stubble loud in the quiet room. He stared into the fire, his face a mask of stone. "So you didn't steal anything?" he finally asked, his voice low. "No, of course not," she cried, stung by the question. "My only crime was refusing to be sold." He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I figured as much." He stood up and walked to the cabin door, looking out at the setting sun that was bleeding color across his land. "The thorns," he said, more to himself than to her. "They've been poisoning this county for years. They dammed up Willow Creek last spring, nearly starved out the Miller family downstream. A man stands up to them. His fences get cut, his stock goes missing." He turned back, and for the first time Violet saw something other than weariness in his eyes. It was a flicker of something hard and dangerous, like flint striking steel. "They think they own everything they see," he said. "And everyone." He looked directly at her, and his gaze was an unspoken promise. "They ain't taking you from here." The knowledge that the enemy was closing in didn't bring panic, but a strange, quiet resolve. The cabin, once a simple shelter, became a fortress. Cal's routines took on a new urgency. He spent his days not just tending to his small ranch, but reinforcing it. He checked the hinges on the door, oiled his rifle until it gleamed, and spent hours in the small barn, seemingly sharpening tools and mending tack. Violet, in turn, worked with a feverish intensity, as if, by making herself useful, she could somehow repay the monumental risk he was taking. She took over the cooking completely, learning to make passable stews from salted meat and wild onions. She tended a small vegetable patch behind the cabin that had been neglected, weeding and watering it with a fierce determination. She was nursing the small, struggling seedlings back to life, and felt in a way that she was doing the same for herself. The barrier of silence between them began to crumble, worn away by shared work and shared danger. The conversation started small. "Where did you learn to track like that?" she asked one evening, as he cleaned the mud from his boots. "My father," he answered, his voice quiet. "He was a trapper. Lived more in the mountains than in a town. He taught me how to read the land before I could read a book." Another day, as he watched her carefully stitch a tear in the linen shirt, he spoke without being prompted. "That was Mary's," he said, his voice rough with disuse, like a rusty hinge. Violet froze her needle poised in mid-air. "Mary, my wife." He didn't look at her, focusing instead on braiding a new rope of leather. "She planted that garden you're tending, had a touch with things, could make anything grow." He paused, and the silence was heavy with everything he wasn't saying. "Fever took her. And our girl, Sarah. 5 years ago this spring." He finally looked up, and his grey eyes were vast and haunted. "The marker by the cottonwoods. That's theirs." The truth landed in the small cabin with the weight of a tombstone. The ghost of his loneliness now had a name. 2 names. Violet's heart ached for him, for the unimaginable loss that had hollowed him out and left this quiet, capable shell of a man. "I'm so sorry, Calvin," she whispered. He just nodded, accepting her words as if they were a familiar weight. But something had shifted. By sharing his deepest wound, he had let her in. He had trusted her with his grief. In return, Violet found herself sharing parts of her own past, not the story of her escape, but of the life before. She told him about her mother who had loved poetry and had died when Violet was young. She pulled out the small, worn book she had saved, and one evening by the firelight she read a poem aloud. It was about the sea, something Cal had never seen. He listened, his head leaned back against the rough-hewn wall, his eyes closed. The cadence of her voice, soft and educated, filled the rustic cabin, a strange and beautiful counterpoint to the chirping of crickets outside. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "It's good," he said finally, "to hear a different sound in this place." A fragile intimacy began to grow between them, cultivated in the shared space of their respective sorrows. One afternoon, Cal was splitting logs for the fire. The axe was heavy, and he worked with a powerful rhythmic grace. Violet was hanging laundry on a line, strung between two trees, when she heard a sharp curse. She turned to see him leaning against the woodpile, his face pale. Blood was seeping through the fingers clutched around his left forearm. She ran to him. "What happened?" Axehead glanced off a knot. He gritted out his breath, hissing through his teeth. Without hesitation, she took his arm. "Let me see." "In the cabin." He was reluctant to be cared for, but the wound was deep and bleeding freely. She sat him at the table, her hand surprisingly steady as she washed the gash with clean water and whiskey from his flask, ignoring his sharp intake of breath. The cut was long and jagged, but clean. She found the spare cloth in the trunk, the same one she had used for mending, and tore it into strips. As she wrapped his arm, her fingers brushed against his skin. It was warm and solid. Their proximity was electric, the air thick with unspoken things. He watched her, his grey eyes intense, tracking the movement of her hands. "You've got a steady hand, Miss Vance," he said, his voice low. "It's Violet," she said softly, not looking up from her task of tying the final knot. "I think we are past formalities." He didn't reply, but his gaze remained on her. When she was done, her hands lingered on his arm for a moment longer than necessary. She looked up and met his eyes. The space between them seemed to shrink. The silence charged with a tension that had nothing to do with the Thorn posse, and everything to do with the man and woman sitting at the small wooden table. He was the first to break the gaze, clearing his throat and pulling his arm back slowly. "Thank you." Violet, the way he said her name, letting it settle in the quiet air, was a revelation. It wasn't the way her father said it, like a commodity, or the way Jonah had said it, like a possession. It was just her name, spoken with a quiet respect that made her feel seen for the first time in a very long time. That night, as she lay on her cot and he on his bedroll, the distance across the small room felt both infinite and infinitesimal. She was no longer just a refugee he was protecting. He was no longer just her stoic savior. They were a man and a woman, both scarred by their pasts, tentatively carefully finding a seedling of something new in the barren soil of their shared solitude. And outside, under the vast star-dusted sky, the threat of the thorns galloped ever closer. The supply of salt was gone, and the flour was nearly out. It was a simple, unavoidable fact of life. "I have to go to town," Cal announced one morning, his tone leaving no room for argument. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the warm domesticity Violet had begun to feel. "It's too dangerous. They'll be watching. They'll ask questions. It's more dangerous to be without supplies come winter," he countered, pulling on his worn duster. "I'll be careful. Keep my ears open and my mouth shut." Besides, he added, a grim set to his jaw, "It's time I heard the lay of the land for myself." Can't fight a snake if you don't know where it's coiled. He gave her strict instructions. Keep the door barred. Don't go outside unless absolutely necessary. Keep the rifle loaded and close. He showed her how to work the mechanism, his large hands covering hers, as he guided her through the motions of loading the cartridges and working the lever action. The cold steel felt heavy and alien in her hands. Just point and pull the trigger, he said. Don't think about it. The ride to redemption took Cal half a day. As he trotted his sturdy buckskin horse, Dusty, down the town's main street, he felt the change immediately. There was a tension in the air, a nervous energy. Men watched him from the shadows of storefronts, their eyes lingering on him, a moment too long. He tied Dusty outside the general store and pushed through the doors, the bell above tinkling a cheerful, deceptive welcome. Inside, the usual group of old-timers were gathered around the pot-bellied stove, but they fell silent as he entered. Even old Miller, the store's proprietor, seemed nervous, his eyes darting toward the door. Cal Miller said, forcing a smile. Been a while. What can I get for you? The usual, Cal said, his voice level. Flour, salt, coffee, cartridges. As Miller measured out the flour, a poster tacked to the wall behind him caught Cal's eye. It was new, the paper still crisp. At the top, in big, bold letters, was the word Reward. Beneath it was a crudely sketched but recognizable drawing of a woman with fine features and dark hair. $500 for the capture of the thief, Elara Vance, and the return of the Thorne family jewels. Cal's blood turned to ice. A thief! The sheer diabolical brilliance of it hit him like a physical blow. Silas Thorne hadn't painted his son as a fool who couldn't keep his bride. He had painted Violet as a criminal. He had turned the entire county into a posse of bounty hunters. Now anyone sheltering her wasn't a good Samaritan. They were harboring a fugitive. He kept his face impassive as he paid for his goods. New poster, he commented, idly gesturing with his chin. Miller swallowed hard, refusing to meet his eyes. Aye, the Thorns were wronged something fierce. That woman played them all for fools, seemed so, Cal said, non-committally. He was loading his supplies onto Dusty when a voice drawled behind him. Well, look what the dust dragged in. Calvin Stone. Cal turned slowly. It was Jonah Thorne, flanked by two of his hired guns, their hands hovering near their pistols. Jonah was smiling a smug, superior twist of his lips. Thorne Cal acknowledged with a curt nod. Been a while since you graced us with your presence, Stone Jonah said, walking a slow circle around Cal and his horse. Staying busy out on that patch of dirt you call a ranch? Busy enough. Jonah stopped, his eyes narrowing. Funny thing. My father and I were just talking about your patch of dirt, specifically the stream that runs through it. The North Fork. Cal's hands tensed. What about it? It feeds into our lower grazing meadows, Jonah said, his voice turning silky and dangerous. We're thinking of expanding our herd. We're going to need more water. We've decided to dam the North Fork about a mile upstream from your property line. Cal stared at him, his face hardening into granite. Damming the stream there would turn his own water supply into a useless trickle. It would kill his pasture, starve his few cattle, and make his land uninhabitable within a season. It was a death sentence for his homestead. That stream is my water right, Thorne. It's on the deed. Jonah laughed, a short, ugly sound. Deeds can be amended. My father has friends in the territorial office. The point is, Stone, we want that water. But my father is a generous man. He's willing to overlook your claim. For a price. I'm not selling. Oh, not selling, Jonah said, stepping closer until he was invading Cal's space. We were thinking more of a public service. You see, we're looking for a thief. A woman. Pretty thing, dark hair. You spend a lot of time alone out there. You see things other folks don't. If you were to say, 'Find this thief and bring her to us,' my father would be so grateful he might just forget all about that little stream." The threat was laid bare. It wasn't a random encounter. They knew. Or they suspected. They were squeezing him, using the water rights as a lever to pry Violet from his protection. Cal's gaze was flat and cold as a river stone. "If I see a thief on my land, Thorn, I'll hand them over to the sheriff. Not to you." Jonah's smile vanished. His fist shot out, catching Cal on the jaw. The blow was unexpected, sending Cal staggering back against his horse. Before he could recover, the two hired guns grabbed his arms, pinning him. Jonah stepped forward and drove his fist into Cal's stomach. The air rushed from Cal's lungs. "The sheriff works for us." Jonah snarled, his face inches from Cal's. "Everyone works for us. You have 1 week, Stone. 1 week to bring us the girl. Or I'm coming to your ranch with 12 men and we're going to burn you out. We'll take the girl, we'll take the water, and we'll salt the earth where your pathetic little cabin stands." He shoved Cal back. The hired guns released him, and he slumped against Dusty, gasping for breath. The trio swaggered away, laughing, leaving him alone in the street, the dust settling around him. Cal stood there for a long moment, the pain in his gut and jaw a dull throb compared to the cold, burning rage in his chest. This was never just about Violet. It was about power. It was about the Thorns' insatiable need to crush anything they couldn't own or control. He slowly, painfully pulled himself into the saddle. He knew with chilling certainty that he wasn't just riding back to a woman in hiding. He was riding back to a war he never asked for, but one he would now have to finish. The ride back was a blur of pain and fury. By the time Cal saw the thin curl of smoke from his cabin's chimney, the sun was low and the sky was bruised with twilight. He dismounted, every muscle aching, and stumbled toward the door. Violet must have heard him coming. The bar on the inside of the door scraped back, and she opened it, her face etched with a week's worth of worry. The relief in her eyes instantly vanished, replaced by horror as she saw his split lip and the dark, angry bruise already forming on his jaw. "Calvin, what happened?" She rushed to his side, her hands fluttering near his face as she helped him inside. "Thorn," he growled, sinking heavily into a chair. She was a whirlwind of motion, fetching the whiskey and a clean cloth, her earlier nervousness replaced by a fierce, protective anger. As she gently dabbed at the cut on his lip, he flinched not from the sting of the alcohol, but from the tenderness of her touch. He knows she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "He knows I'm here." He suspects. Cal corrected his voice, raspy. He took a long swallow from the whiskey bottle she offered him. The raw spirit burned a trail down his throat. But that's not all of it. He told her everything. The poster branding her a thief, the $500 bounty on her head, and then he told her about the stream, about the ultimatum Jonah had given him. 1 week to turn her over, or they would destroy everything. When he finished, Violet backed away from him, her face ashen. The cloth dropped from her hand. Guilt so profound it was like a physical sickness washed over her. She had fled a gilded cage only to lead a serpent into this man's simple, hard-won garden. "This is my fault," she said, her voice trembling. "I brought this on you. Your home, your land, everything Mary built." Her voice broke. "You have to let me go, Calvin. Give me up to them. You can tell them you just found me. They'll give you the reward. They'll leave your water alone. You can't lose your home because of me." Cal slammed the whiskey bottle down on the table, the sharp crack echoing in the tense silence. He surged to his feet, his towering frame seeming to fill the entire cabin. His grey eyes, usually so calm and weary, were now blazing with a fire she had never seen. "No," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You don't get it, do you? You think this is about you. This started long before you ever climbed into my chicken coop. This is about them. About a sickness that's been eating this land for a decade. They take what they want. Waterland people. It doesn't matter. They won't stop with you. They won't stop with my stream. They won't stop until they own the sunset." He took a step closer to her, his anger so potent it was a palpable force in the room. "For 5 years I've done nothing. I've hidden out here, tended my ghosts, and let the world go on. I watched them squeeze out the Millers. I watched them intimidate good men in town. And I did nothing. I told myself it wasn't my fight. I had nothing left to lose." He reached out and cupped her face in his hand, his calloused thumb gently stroking her cheek. His touch was a startling contrast to the fury in his voice. "I was wrong," he said, his voice dropping, becoming thick with emotion. "I was wrong." Violet stared up at him, her breath caught in her throat. In that moment, she saw past the stoic rancher, past the grieving husband. She saw a man pushed to his absolute limit, a man who had finally found a reason to fight again. And she was that reason. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of fear, of guilt, but also of a strange, fierce pride. "But they'll kill you, Calvin." "They'll try," he said, a grim smile touching his bruised lips. "Men like Thorne, they're bullies. They count on folks being too scared to fight back. They're not used to being told no." He let his hand fall from her face. A new energy seemed to flow through him, a sense of purpose that straightened his shoulders and cleared the weariness from his eyes. He was no longer a man hiding from the world. He was a man preparing to make a stand. "We're not giving you up," he said, his voice ringing with finality. "We're not running. This is my home. They want a war, they've found one." He turned and strode to the small wooden trunk at the foot of his cot. He knelt and lifted the lid. He removed the folded child's blanket, setting it aside with a reverence that made Violet's heart ache. Beneath it lay another rifle, this one, older, a Winchester 73 and a heavy Colt revolver in a worn leather holster. He looked back at Violet, his expression one of grim resolve. "Jonah gave us a week," he said, checking the action on the rifle. "That gives us 6 days to get ready." Violet looked at the determination etched on his face, at the weapons laid out on the floor, at the small, sturdy cabin that had become her world. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But alongside it, something else was growing. Courage, a feeling so foreign and yet so powerful, it felt like she was breathing for the first time. She had spent her life being told what to do, being treated as a possession. She had run from one man who tried to own her only to be hunted by him. But she wasn't running anymore. She walked over to the hearth, picked up the rifle Cal had first taught her to use, and held it firmly in her hands. The steel was no longer alien. It was the price of her freedom. "All right, Calvin Stone," she said, her voice clear and steady. "What do we do first?" The 6 days that followed were a blur of frantic, focused labor. The ranch transformed from a quiet homestead into a fortified position. Cal, drawing on a deep well of survival knowledge his trapper father had taught him, became a general, mapping out a battlefield. He and Violet dragged heavy logs and rocks, creating low barricades near the cabin and the barn. He boarded up the single window in the cabin, leaving only a small, narrow slit for a rifle barrel. He showed Violet the best places for cover: a deep irrigation ditch that ran along the edge of the property, a rock outcropping that overlooked the main approach to the cabin. "They'll expect me to be holed up in here," he explained, tapping the cabin wall. "They'll be arrogant, they'll ride in close. That's our advantage." Violet, driven by adrenaline and a fierce will to survive, worked tirelessly alongside him. Her hands, once soft and pampered, were now blistered and raw, but she didn't complain. She hauled water-loaded cartridges until her fingers were numb and practiced with the rifle for hours on end, the kick of the stock bruising her shoulder. At first, she couldn't hit the side of the barn, but Cal was patient. "Don't aim at the whole can," he'd tell her, pointing to a tin can perched on a fence post 50 yards away. "Aim at one single spot on the can. Squeeze the trigger, don't pull it. Let the shot surprise you." Slowly, her aim improved. The powerful crack of the rifle became less a sound of fear and more one of defiance. In the evenings, they would sit in the dim firelit cabin, the silence between them no longer awkward or sad, but filled with the deep, unspoken bond of soldiers before a battle. They were a unit, a partnership forged in desperation. The lines of propriety had long since blurred. One night, exhausted and sore, Violet fell asleep at the table, her head resting on her arms. Cal gently lifted her and carried her to the cot, pulling the wool blanket over her. He watched her for a long moment, her face peaceful in sleep, and felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it stole his breath. This was about more than his land now. On the dawn of the 7th day, a heavy mist clung to the ground, muffling the world in a blanket of grey silence. The air was still and cold with anticipation. They were ready. Cal positioned Violet in the irrigation ditch. It offered excellent cover and a clear line of sight to the front of the cabin. "Stay here no matter what," he commanded, his voice tight. "Don't fire until I do. Wait for them to get close. And if things go badly, you run. Don't look back. Head north into the hills. You can lose them there." She grabbed his arm. "Calvin." He looked down at her, his face grim in the pre-dawn light. He leaned in and pressed his lips to her forehead, a brief, hard kiss that was both a promise and a goodbye. "Be safe, Violet." Then he was gone, melting into the mist toward the rock outcropping. Violet lay in the damp ditch, the cold earth seeping into her clothes, the rifle clutched in her hands. She had never known a fear so complete. It was a living thing coiling in her gut. She waited. The mist began to burn off as the sun rose, and the world slowly came into focus. Then she heard it. The distant, rhythmic drumming of hoofbeats. It started as a low rumble and grew steadily louder. They were coming. A group of riders crested the low ridge a half-mile away. She counted 10 of them. At the front, arrogant and proud on a magnificent black stallion, was Jonah Thorne. Beside him rode his father Silas, looking less like a rancher and more like a king reviewing his troops. They rode in as if they owned the place, their laughter carrying on the morning air. They didn't fan out. They didn't scout for trouble. Just as Cal had predicted, their arrogance was their weakness. They trotted right into the open space in front of the cabin and dismounted, tethering their horses. Stone Jonah bellowed, striding toward the cabin door. "Your week is up. I've come for my property. Send out the girl and we might let you live, Silence." Jonah laughed. "Hiding, are you? It won't do you any good." He kicked the door hard. "I'm going to enjoy burning this shack to the ground." That's when the first shot rang out. It came from the rocks, a deafening crack that echoed across the clearing. One of the hired guns standing near Jonah grunted and crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his chest. For a second, there was stunned silence. Then chaos erupted. The Thorne men scrambled for cover, yanking their rifles from their saddle scabbards. They fired wildly toward the rocks, their bullets pinging harmlessly off the granite. Jonah, his face a mask of rage, took cover behind a water trough. "He's in the rocks!" "Flank him!" Two men broke away, running toward the side to get a better angle on Cal's position. Violet's heart was hammering so hard she could barely breathe. "Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it." She lined up her sights on the second man, just as Cal had taught her. She aimed for the center of his chest. Her hands were trembling. She took a deep breath, held it, and squeezed. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The man she'd aimed at spun around, clutching his leg, and fell with a cry of pain. The shot from the ditch stunned the Thorn gang. They were being fired on from two directions. They were caught in a crossfire. Panic began to set in. Another shot from Cal's position took down a second man. The fight became a brutal, terrifying exchange of gunfire. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the shouts of angry, frightened men. Violet reloaded her movements, clumsy but effective, her fear replaced by a cold, clear focus. She wasn't a fine lady from the East anymore. She was a woman defending her life and the life of the man who had saved her. Silas Thorne, the old wolf, was smarter than his son. He realized their mistake. "Fall back," he roared. "To the horses, we'll get them from a distance." But as he turned, a single figure rose from behind the woodpile, a place no one had been watching. It was Cal. He'd used the initial chaos to change his position. He held his Colt revolver, and it was aimed directly at Silas Thorne. "It's over." Thorne Cal's voice boomed, cutting through the gunfire. Everything stopped. The remaining hired guns froze, seeing their employer at gunpoint. Jonah, seeing his father threatened, saw red. He raised his own pistol, not at Cal, but at the ditch where the second shooter had to be. Drop it, Stone, or the girl dies. It was a standoff. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the tension. The thundering of more hoofbeats, coming fast from the west. A lone rider appeared, a grizzled old man on a wiry Mustang, a shotgun held across his lap. "Cal." "You all right?" the man yelled. It was Gus Cal's nearest neighbor, a man who lived 10 miles away. He must have heard the prolonged gunfire and come to investigate. His arrival, another gun on Cal's side, tipped the scales. The Thorne men exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't the easy fight they'd been promised. In that split second of distraction, Violet made her move. She didn't rise to shoot. She did something they would never expect. She scrambled out of the far side of the ditch, staying low, and circled around behind the tethered horses. With a loud yell, she slapped the rump of Jonah's black stallion. The horse, already spooked by the gunfire, reared and bolted, and the other horses tied to it followed suit. In a matter of seconds, the Thorns' escape route was gone, a stampede of riderless horses thundering across the prairie. The sight of their escaping horses broke the nerve of the remaining hired guns. This wasn't their fight. It wasn't worth dying for. One by one, they dropped their weapons and raised their hands. Only Jonah was left. His face was a contorted mask of pure hatred. His father was a captive his men had surrendered. His horses were gone. He had lost. He let out a wordless roar of fury and leveled his pistol, not at Cal, but straight at Violet. A shot cracked the air. Not from Cal's revolver. Not from Gus's shotgun. Jonah staggered, a look of shocked surprise on his face. He looked down at his own chest where a red flower was blooming on his shirt. He fell to his knees, then pitched forward into the dust. Violet stood 20 yards away, the smoking rifle still held to her shoulder. Her face was pale, her expression one of disbelief. She had aimed for his arm to disarm him, but in her haste, her aim had been true in the worst possible way. Silence descended on the bloody clearing. Silas Thorne let out a strangled cry and rushed to his son's side, but it was too late. The great Thorn Empire had lost its heir. Cal walked slowly over to Violet, who was staring at Jonah's still form, the rifle slipping from her grasp. He gently took the weapon from her and wrapped his arms around her as she began to shake uncontrollably. "It's over," he whispered into her hair. "It's over. You're safe." He held her tight, a lone man and a runaway bride standing together in the wreckage of their battlefield, the morning sun casting long shadows across the land they had refused to surrender. In the end, the story of Violet Vance and Calvin Stone wasn't just about a runaway bride or a lonely cowboy. It's a story that proves that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. It shows us that a home isn't just four walls and a roof, but a place worth fighting for, and that true love can blossom in the most barren of landscapes, watered by loyalty and respect. Violet ran from a life of gilded emptiness and found a life of rugged, authentic purpose. Cal, a man who thought his life was over, discovered a new beginning in the eyes of a woman who needed his help, and who in turn saved him from his own solitude. Their story reminds us that sometimes the greatest acts of defiance are not loud revolutions, but the quiet, unwavering refusal to be broken. If their journey from a dusty chicken coop to a hard-won dawn has moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share this story with someone who appreciates tales of courage and unlikely love. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next story from the heart of the Old West. Thank you for listening.